All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm first going to spend not a lot of time, all right, because I want us to go over that exercise that we talked about last week. I gave everybody a copy of it. If you weren't here and didn't get a copy, you're going to have to let me know and I'll print you out a copy. But the idea was what we had to begin with, what I gave you, if you keyed that in, was you ran it rather, and this is what it looked like. It was a form, didn't look very nice, all right? And then we had that basically you make some changes to it and it'll look like that. After yesterday, I don't know if I want that to become a backer on there anymore, but I'm just going to leave it up there. Okay, so like I said, first thing we're going to do is we are going to go over the stuff that is in Chapter 13. All right. Now, when we were working on this, when you've worked on the test, etc., most of the tests, I guess the second one on or so, you had a form. All right. And the idea is we never really talked about it because we hadn't talked about forms yet. All right. So we're going to look at everything basically that you see here. All right. Most everything that you see here when they get down to here and they talk about HTML5, most everything is supported by all major browsers. All right. There are still a few things that are a little funky occasionally. Dates and times have a tendency not to always work, etc. We'll get into those as we get going. Now, for now, what we'll concentrate on is not only creating a form, but doing very simple validations. And when I say simple, they're built into the system. We just have to, for lack of better words, turn them on. So for instance, if I've got a field like this, okay, and I click submit, notice, hopefully you can see that it says please fill out this field. All right, and all I had to do in order to get that was to literally, after I ended up putting in the field, add the word required, which just means just that, the field is required. In fact, I put required on most all of these fields right here. All right, bless you. So like I said, we'll take a look at that. But the idea is after this, okay, and again, I think I've mentioned this to you. What I'm going to do today is we're going to go over chapters 13 and 14, whatever they are. This one on forms and the next one on audio, visual, or video. And tomorrow, I'd like to go over the last two chapters that we'll cover. And one is on fonts. And the only thing I'm really concerned with in there is that you understand how to use Google Fonts. So if you want to be able to add those. All right. And then the last chapter has got some kind of neat stuff in there on CSS Transitions. It's a little bit of getting some special effects onto a website. All right. I'm not going to require that you do that for the test. Now, next week when you come in here, this is an FYI, what I'll do, and if I've got it done by Friday, I'll give it to you then. But next week, the whole week is lab, just so you know, every day. Why? Because what you're going to be working on is the midterm. We're finishing up all the HTML, CSS stuff that we'll be working on. Then the following week after that, which is like 2 weeks from now, like the 22nd, I think it is, then we're going to be moving into JavaScript on that day. And you will start programming 2 weeks from today, and I mean really programming. All right? When we get to that point, and it'll be sooner in that part rather than later, we'll learn another way that you can validate forms. All right? Actually, you'll learn a couple ways. We'll validate them using JavaScript, and then we'll validate them using jQuery. All right, so again, that's all stuff that you've got to look forward to. So when you've got a form consists of controls. Now, this is a very simple form, and what does it have? Literally, it has about 3 different controls on it. That's a label. That's what's referred to typically as a text box, and that's a button. All right. Now, do I expect you to remember all these? No. But they show you in here how to create a form. All right. Some of this stuff, again, was in the form that I gave you. Not all of it. I want to mention something to you right now which may not make a lot of sense to you at this moment, but when we get into talking about JavaScript, hopefully then it'll make more sense. For instance, notice here it says ID equals, and it's email form. We have always used the ID when we set up an ID so we can work on something with CSS, and we'll continue to do that. But the other thing is, okay, when we get into the JavaScript part of the class, we will be using something that's called get element by ID. And if we choose to get an element by ID and we choose it to be that one, then we can manipulate this programmatically. All right, again, you'll see this as we go on. All right. So notice what it says in there, the type of control you want. Input type equal text. You're going to see all, I tried to set it up so I put as many of these things in here as I possibly could. All right. So I already told you what ID was. Most of the time, and they don't even have it in this example, but most of the time when you set up a form and you start setting up things in it, not only do you have ID equals, but you have name equals. Right? Do you have to care about that? This semester, not at all. But the name equals stuff allows you to do stuff on the server side as opposed to the client side, which is the way we're doing everything this semester. Disabled should make sense. You know, if you disable something, it'll be grayed out, it'll show, but you won't be able to do anything with it. And read-only is means just that. All right, it's something that you can't change. So if you set up something like this, again, you end up getting something like this. All right. Now, when you click subscribe, typically, and you may or may not have ever noticed this if you've been on the internet and you've filled out some kind of a form, but quite often if you've got something like this subscribe and you click the button, you'll get something that looks like this. All right, and I wouldn't expect that to make a whole heck of a lot of sense to you, but the idea is when you look right here, there is a question mark and then there's a bunch of stuff after the question mark. From the question mark on, all that stuff that you see in there is what's referred to as a query string. Again, these are all terms you're going to hear again, but I've just decided to introduce them to you now. All right, so a form is just basically, it's something that can contain controls. All right, you should always have, everything that's on the form should have an ID attribute. Really, it should have both an ID attribute and a name attribute. All right. So the next thing to get into here is how you can set up different kinds of buttons. I'm not going to read to you. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to do that. But you can set up different kinds of buttons. All right. For instance, if you set up a button and it says button type equals submit, like that, all right, what that typically means, it's not going to look all that cool or whatever, but this one says checkout. When you click this and you've got something that's of type submit, normally it's going to call some server-side thing. Does everybody understand this? That if I go out, I'm not going to do this, but if I go out to the internet right now and I go out to Amazon and I click a button, for example, to click an entry to put it in my cart, and then I go into my shopping cart and I go and purchase that. Does it make sense to everybody when it says purchase? If I click a button, that's got to basically send a message that includes my information, my purchase information, but it's got to send it out to a server someplace. Does that make sense? All right, because if it stayed on my local machine, how would I ever be able to get it? So it has to be shared somehow. All right, and that's kind of what they're getting into right here. Also, notice there's a button here that says reset. Well, as we get into this, just to show you this real quick, I'm just going to come in here and notice there's a whole bunch of stuff. I'm going to click here, I'm going to click here, I'm going to click right there, and I'll put in a bunch of stuff here. It doesn't matter what it is. All right, but when I click reset, notice what happens. All right, it resets everything back to its default value. All right, that's what reset is. And in order to do that, all you have to basically do when you create the button is to say input type equal reset. That's it. So again, much of the stuff that you have to do in here is quite automated for you. All right, so there's different types of buttons that you can create. All right, text fields are typically called text boxes, and it's where you put stuff. There's examples. Now, one of the things that we'll look at a little bit later in this chapter is we'll talk a little bit about regular expressions. All right, but the idea is for quantity, I can set that up as a number field, which means that if I try typing anything non-numeric in there, it won't take it. And I can also set up a minimum and a maximum. So let's assume the minimum you can buy is 1 and the maximum you can buy is 100. All right. Then if you try to put in anything that's out of range and you try to submit the form, you're going to get an error. Hopefully, again, that makes sense. All right. Passwords. Most people know this already, but typically if you've got a field that's set up as a password field and you enter information into it, it either looks on the screen, it comes up as a series of black dots or as a series of black asterisks. All right. In a hidden field, there's reasons to use a hidden field, and a hidden field is just that. It's a field that doesn't show on the form. So imagine that I was creating a form for, as an example, I don't know, Pizza Hut. All right. And I went and it set it up so you ordered a whole bunch of stuff. And it showed you your subtotal. And then it said place the order. Well, you know that's not your total. It's going to have to add the tax, correct? Okay? And then it'll go and basically send it out. But the point is that field that holds the tax rate, probably don't have to show it online to anybody. I can make that a hidden field. So certain fields it makes sense to have hidden, all right, on forms. Radio buttons and checkboxes. Usually the easiest way to explain radio buttons is, I mean, they show it here and it's fine. But most often the way you see radio buttons set up are for gender. All right? And it's something in the world that we live in right now. I suppose if people are transitioning or whatever. But if you noticed, one of the things that I put in here, because this is the recommended way of doing it now, is male, female, and other. All right. A friend of mine, I'm not making this up, he lives in Madison, Wisconsin, and he's a veteran. And he was telling me that he was in the VA and he was filling out a form, and under gender, there were 16 options. I mean, it was all sorts of stuff that he had never even heard of before. All right. But if you look in here, the idea, the difference between these two, not just that one is circular and one is rectangular, but when you're working with radio buttons, two things. First of all, notice they all have the same name. What you're really creating is what's referred to as a radio button group. And it comes from the olden days, you know, like back, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, however long it was, when cars had an AM radio in it. And with the AM radio, they had the push buttons for the different radio selections. And the idea is you could only push in one at a time. That's how these got their name. All right. But only one can be chosen. Okay. And if I want one to be chosen, as it says there, I can put the word checked in there. Now, it used to be before HTML5, you know, if you wanted it checked, like you see here and like you see here, you literally had to type in checked equals checked, which was stupid, but that's the way that it was set up. One of the things they changed with HTML5 was you just have to say checked. Okay, and not a big thing one way or the other. But again, only one of these can be active. If where they have checked here, if they didn't have this word, so if this word was gone right there, then none of these would be checked. But once you check a button in there, one has to be checked all the time. All right? Unless you turn it off with code. And with the toppings, I can choose none of these, any one, any two, or all three. So again, the big difference is radio buttons, one thing, all right? Checkboxes, 0 all the way up to all things. Notice with the checkboxes too, the name is not the same. All right? So they explain that in the book. I don't know if I made it easier or harder to understand. drop-down lists, one of the things that I'd asked you to do on yours was to create a drop-down list that had the states on it. All right, and again, where did I get that from? I'm not that good, but I typed in something like select US states. All right, and that was it. It was from Free Formatter. So the nice thing is, if you ever have to do that, all you have to do is grab all that code. All right. So what's special about that code? Well, let's take a quick look at it. All right. So notice it says select ID equals style and size. That's all fine. But what they're doing in here is you're creating options. So select, that's what I had you put in for state, and options had all your state names in it. All right. Now they're using option groups and stuff in here. I don't know why they went to that extreme, because they're not even used that often, but they did. Notice it says, by default, the first option in a list is selected when the page is loaded. Have you ever filled out a form online where the first option under state says, please select state? All right. Rather than, because if you don't do that, then it automatically defaults to Alabama, because that's the first one if you put them in there in the alphabetic order. All right. Now, just so you see it, in the one that we're working on, where we've got the state. No, there it is. If you look right here, you'll notice that under Missouri, I thought I had it selected. Maybe I don't. All right. But we can say that we want that one to be selected. And then if we do that, well, that's the original one. Here we go. So if we say selected, what that means is when I go and run this, notice what state comes up there by default. Now again, if I was writing an application for Rankin Technical College, that's probably what I'd do. All right. On the other hand, if I was writing an application for Amazon, I probably would have a thing here that would say, please enter the appropriate, your estate or something like that. All right. The other thing too is if you put in here an entry at the beginning that says, please enter your state, and the person goes and they're all done and they click a submit button, and the state is still set to please enter your state, you know they haven't entered a state. All right. So you can check for that in code. Yes. Are you talking about like if you put in here, for example, if I came in here and put in like that? Yeah. What this is to do this, that's not code. That's just set to autocomplete, which says after you set it the first time, unless you turn autocomplete off. But if we sat there and actually wrote in all the code where all you had to put in, for example, was a zip code, and it would fill in the rest of the stuff for you, that's a hell of a lot of code. Because there are thousands, I don't know how many total zip codes there are, but if I was told there's 10,000, I'd believe it. Right? List boxes, that's typically you can have one or more things chosen. All right, again, you're going to see those in just a couple minutes. By default, when you've got a list box, again, it's a list of options, 2 or more. By default, only one can be chosen at a time. But if you set this to multiple, then you can choose as many as you want. Text areas, and again, in the example that I showed you right here, makes sense? That would be a text area. All right, if you've ever filled out any kind of a form for a dental office or whatever, I know I started with a new dentist a couple months ago, and I had to fill that out, and they did have something in that. I don't remember what it was. But for example, if it was a doctor's office, they might have in their hobbies. All right, because if you're a bungee jumper, all right, or you're a daredevil, they may want to know that type of thing. All right, and when you set this up, you say how many rows you want and how many columns. I guess the other way, how many rows you want and how many columns you want. All right, so I'm hoping you're going to go in and play with this stuff yourselves, and then you'll see. All right, how you can sit there and maneuver it and play around with it, etc. Labels, one thing that they changed in HTML5, again, is this a big thing? Not at all, but just so you hear this, notice for the label, it says label 4 equal crust 1, all right? And then someplace they're going to have crust 1. Okay, but the point is this. When you set up a label and you use this 4 equals, which it's not mandatory, just so you know, it's not mandatory. But if you put the 4 equals, if you click on the label, it moves you right into the box. Again, not like that's a big thing one way or the other, but that's one of the things they did, why they did it. Field sets and legends, if you look up on the screen here, where you see these boxes, those are field sets. The legends are the words crust and the word toppings. All right. Typically, it's used to group common elements. You might have in here a person's name, address, city, state, zip. You might have in here other types of information. All right. You can have one big field set. You can have several field sets. You can have no field sets. The file upload control, you know, in the past I haven't even talked about this that much, but I was thinking about it, and in terms of the in terms of working on the Leave Me at Home site, I thought it would make sense that Tom might want on his form a picture of the animal that he's about to get. All right? Or if, you know, if somebody's interested, maybe a picture of the owner and the animal type of an idea. All right? Maybe you've seen those commercials, what is it, that for that windshield place, Safeguard or whatever it's called. They were showing for a while that what happened was when they sent you a message, they would send you a picture of the person who was going to come out there to service your vehicle. All right? This is the same kind of thing in that you're giving some advanced information. All right? I mean, Tom's probably going to handle it differently if he knows he's getting a Great Dane versus if he knows he's getting a Chihuahua. That type of an idea. All right? Now, much of the rest of this, how to align controls here. All right? What happens is this starts to be aesthetic in nature. All right? In other words, I showed you this before, but when you look at this, those things, everything basically that's in there, it's just kind of smushed in right here. All right? Stuff doesn't line up. By default, these are left justified, all the labels, and by default, the text boxes just start when the labels end. All right? So you have to add some CSS to make that look more like this. All right? And that's what they're talking about in there when they mention aligning controls. And there's, I'm sure you know this, there's many ways that you can do that. All right? Here is additional formatting. So what have they done in here? They've come in here and they've changed the color. All right? Again, I'm to the point where I've got to have Tom make some decisions, what colors he wants, what fonts he wants, etc. The other thing that we'll get to, not right now, but when we get into the JavaScript and the jQuery part of the class, is if you put something in here, all right, by default now, I already showed you this, but I want you to see it again. By default now, when you do this, when you come in here and you click Submit, you just get that message that's right there that says, please fill out this field. It's not very descriptive. All right. So once we start to code, we'll see how to use JavaScript or how to use jQuery, and typically we'll put a message over here. We might make it red or whatever. We can have things fade in and fade out, that kind of thing. Yes? It won't clear out everything. I mean, you can make it do that, but typically, if I'm having you fill in 6 fields and you fill in the first 5 okay, and you screw up the 6th one, I don't want you to have to fill in everything. All right, but you can do that if they make an error. You can clear out everything. Yeah, we'll do it. We'll look at it both ways. All right, how to set tab order and assign access keys. Again, many people. I used to give this speech, but you're all too young for what I'm about to tell you. Microsoft typically, and they're used kind of as the example, give you 3 ways of performing the same operation. Okay? You can either, you get some kind of an icon. And that's probably people in your generation. You're just used to using icons for virtually everything. All right? They also typically give you a menu option where it's more textual in nature, and people are used to that. But there are still people out there that, especially a lot of people who act as administrative assistants, for example, that they're used to, when they're right here, they want to hit tab to get here. Then they want to hit tab again. So you can set a tab order. If you don't set a tab order, one gets set for you. And the tab order is set based on the order in which you put things onto the form. That's typically not what you're going to want to have. And again, I've said this to you before, if you go at this with the idea that the person using the form is naive, you want to make it as simple for them to use as possible. All right? Because if it's really hard for them to screw up, then hopefully they won't screw up. All right? Now you'll notice that the first name, the last name, and the email, the F has got an underline, the L has got an underline, and the E has got an underline. All right? Typically with those, what that means is you're set up access keys. So if I want to be able to jump around on my form and I want to be able to jump to email, I can hold down on Control E, and boom, it'll bring me right to that field. All right, we'll look more at how to do that as well. All right, and the rest of the stuff that's in here, the next section in here, talks about the new HTML5 features for data validation. Some of these I've already mentioned. Christian had asked about the autocomplete. That wasn't exactly his question. But again, this autocomplete means that once you've set up the form, and if autocomplete, which is on by default, you can turn it off for the entire form. You can turn it off for individual controls. One thing autocomplete does not do is if you've got a password field, it does not autocomplete that. It always makes you enter that. All right? But you can set this up so that if you come in here and you saw this before, so if I put in Jeff, the autocomplete is going to look for that, and if it finds one and I want it, I can have it fill out every field for me. All right? It's kind of like a save this type of thing. Again, by default, autocomplete is on in all browsers. All right, probably the hardest part of this chapter, and we're going to go through it right now, but it probably will make very little sense to you, is working with regular expressions. All right, I'm going to give you, and I may have even done this already, I don't know. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. There it is. All right. I'm going to quickly show you this URL. You don't have to write it down. You won't necessarily ever have to use it. But if you decide that you want to learn more about regular expressions, this is the place to go. All right. https://www.regularexpressions.info. I believe all you need to type in is this. All right, I think I typed in regularexpression.info instead of expressions. Now, one thing about this, if you look at it, it's not a very nice looking site. All right, it's very functional, but it's not very nice looking. Okay, I don't think they care, to be honest with you. But when you start looking through this, what you'll notice, there's a tutorial on what regular expressions are about, tools and languages. So I could look in here and, for example, I can come down the side. We're eventually going to use JavaScript. So there's a whole thing in there on how to use JavaScript. All right. Now, do you have to use regular expressions? No. Why do you use them? Because they make your life easier. They're kind of a pain in the butt when you learn them. But again, the idea is you're making it as hard as possible for somebody to screw up when they're filling out a form or filling out something else. All right. There's another one I'm going to show you here real quick, and it's called HTML5 Patterns.com. Again, give me a break. just HTTPS. Wow. It's pattern, not patterns. Again, you look at this and it's not a very nice looking site. And you're like, there's nothing in there. There's just a bunch of comments. No, if I want to know how to set up an HTML5 pattern for a telephone, I come right there, I click on phones, and it shows me how to set this up for a pattern. You know, notice there, UK, French, USA. There it is. Okay? And they even have a little try it out section here. So I can come in there and it'll tell you whether or not that works. Okay? There's other ones that are in here, for example, for a postal code, which we typically call a zip code. But if we look through here, oh, I thought they had the US, maybe that's on top. All right, American. Now, I don't expect what I'm about to show you, I don't expect this to make sense. But I just very quickly want to explain to you what each thing in here is. This \D that you see right there, that means digit. Make sense? All right. Instead of \D like that, if you put in \big D, capital D, that means anything but a digit. So that means only digits, that means only non-digits. All right. Then we've got this. Inside of curly braces, there's the number 5. Which means you need to have 5 numbers there. All right. Then they've got in parentheses a bracket and a \minus and a bracket. Everything that's in parentheses here means that it's optional. But in English, what they mean is you can either set it up as number, 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 or number, 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 dash, number, 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 number. Does that make sense? You have to use one of those two formats. So if I enter a zip code that if I put 6 numbers here, I'm going to get an error. All right. Or if I put a dash and only 3 numbers here, I'm going to get an error. All right. So they go through and they give you some commonly used patterns in here. The hardest one, really, believe it or not, probably the hardest one to create a pattern for is last name. Because people have hyphens in their last names. People have apostrophes in their last names. Some people have blank spaces in their last name. Some people don't have any of that stuff in their last name, etc. So I could create a first name, and I could say, for example, that it has to be between 2 and 30 characters, and it can only be number, or it can only be letters. All right? So I could be as granular with that kind of stuff as I want. This is a big one, as you'd probably guess. You may or may not have noticed this, but I sure have, that when I go out there and I go to purchase something and they ask me for a credit card number, when I put in the first 4 digits, they know it's a MasterCard already, based on those digits. All right? And there's also certain things, there are certain patterns, okay? There are certain patterns that are recognized for credit cards, all right? Dates, same kind of thing. I already mentioned the phone numbers to you, all right? So as it says, to use them, you code the expression in the pattern attribute. To learn how to code regular expressions, it says, yeah, you can use their books, right? All right, a data list to present entry options. I don't think I put a data list in the example, but I like this one right here. It says, what is your preferred search engine? And notice they've got a list. Just imagine there were 30 of them in here. Doesn't matter. And if I put in the letter O, it would find Google, it would find Yahoo, it would not find Bing, it would not find Ask, because those last 2 don't have an O in them. So when you work with a data list, somebody can sit there and start typing something in, and then in that list, it'll keep knocking down the number of choices you've got, making it smaller and smaller as you type in more letters. All right. All right, with some of the HTML5 controls that are in here, if you say that something is type email, if I do that, then typically I don't need to use a regular expression pattern. If I put in an email address that's invalid, that will catch it. Same thing with URL. Now, the funky one in here is TEL. And I know we've all seen these. That you go out to a website and it says call, you click that and boom, it comes up in your phone, all right, and it shows you the number, all right. That does not, believe it or not, does not always work, all right. You may say, well, it's always worked for me. It doesn't always work. The other thing too is if you have to, when you call numbers, with most people today, for instance, when I got my phone number for my cell is from Illinois. All right, because that's where I was living when I got the phone and I kept the number. So when I call anybody, basically, I need to put a 1 in front of it. But if I go to, and click the call that, it never puts a 1 in front of it. All right, number and range controls. I mentioned these to you before. So notice minimum 100, maximum 1,000, step 100. What that'll do is that'll create a thing in here that it starts at 100 and it goes to 1,000 by 100s. All right. This one that says rate a book from 1 to 5, with some of these things that are in here, they work just fine. But if you want to be able to do something where you're actually going to keep the results and you want to do something with the results, you may have to add some JavaScript. All right. Again, we'll be looking at that fairly soon. Date and time. Again, date and times are the ones that can be a little bit funky. All right. I think we probably have all seen things like this where you get the date picker. All right. But you've got to realize something about a date picker. Let's say there's a thing in here that asks you, as an example, to set up an appointment. All right. That usually, if you try to do that, and usually they have code in there, but if they don't, I could sit there and what is today, October 8th? What if I put in 10/08/2017? I shouldn't be able to do that because that date's already passed. All right? But with some of these, you are able to do this if they haven't put in checks, for you to be able to do that. And with a lot of these too, they'll put in things in here and they'll have times where people could care less about the time. All right? So again, what you always should be striving for is to make it as simple for a person to use as possible. Or looking at it another way, you should make it as hard as possible for them to do something wrong. All right? Nothing's foolproof. All right. Search controls and search functions. As it says right there, that'll typically go through and either go through your site and look for something, all right, or go through a different site and look for something. We'll look at those a little bit. Color controls, maybe you've seen something like this before where you go out to a site and they might ask you your favorite color and you pick from a color picker like this and boom, it changes the background color of your screen to that color while you're on their site. All right. How to use the output element to display output data. We're not going to worry about that right now because what they're saying in here is for that to work, you have to use JavaScript. All right. Since we have not gone over JavaScript yet, it doesn't make sense to do that. Progress and meter elements. I'm asking, have you all seen things like this on a website? Where, for instance, a really popular one is help us reach our goal, or on a GoFundMe page. And they show you the percentage of where they currently are, that kind of thing. That's typically how things like that are used. All right, and the chapter ends where they give you an HTML5 page with data validation. Now, the reason that this is important, all right, and I want you to make sure that you know these pages. So it's like 494 till about 500. I'm not sure yet. I got to get in contact with Tom this week Okay, what do you want on your form? How do you want it set up? How do you want it validated? And he's going to go, what does that mean? I know he is, because that's what he does whenever I ask him anything. So I'm going to ask him the fields that he wants, and I will show him examples of how he wants it validated. But the example, what I'm trying to show you is in here, notice they're using color and the like. They give you the HTML, but probably even more important than that, they give you the CSS. And they show you how you take everything that's in there and format it. All right. Just very quickly to show you some of this stuff. Some of this I've already mentioned to you. Notice that what they've got in yellow there. Type equal email. That means that it's expecting you to put in a valid email address. Should make sense. Autofocus. You only want one of those on a form. Whatever control you put in there is autofocus. It's usually the top one. It's when the form loads, that's where the cursor is. That's what autofocus means. All right. Required, I've already mentioned. If you leave something, if you leave something out, you're going to get an error message. There is an example of a pattern. All right. AZ09. What that means is either lowercase letters or uppercase letters or digits, and there have to be 6 of them at a minimum, and there is no maximum in this case. You would typically do something like that for a password. All right, you probably have seen something like that. You can be, again, more granular than that. There are a lot of places today, if you're going to set up a password, it has to be, for example, between 8 and 18 characters. So you would change that to 8, 18. All right, you could take the pattern that's in there, and you could say basically that one of those characters had to be uppercase, one of those characters had to be a number, one of those characters had to be a special character. That kind of thing, if you wanted to do that. All right, here's a different one. And notice that's the zip code. We've already talked about that before. There's the telephone number. And again, you should be able to look at this now. What does this mean? It means 3 digits followed by an optional dash, 3 more digits followed by an optional dash, and 4 digits. So for instance, that would take 111-222-3333. That would not take 111 space 222-3333. It wouldn't take that. Why? Because they haven't made a pattern for that. That's why when you're doing something like that, as they show right there, you should set up the error message that lets them know what it is you're looking for. All right. Not only that, hopefully you saw this when you looked at the example that I gave you, but if I go and reset this, all right, first name here, last name here, address here, etc. Okay, that stuff that's in there, those are called placeholders. And you'll notice that if I take my mouse and put it in here, all right, and now I type in an F, that placeholder goes away. All right, but if I remove it, the placeholder comes back again. All right, literally all you do is you say placeholder equals. Now I really didn't need one for first name, last name, address, city. Probably didn't need those. But for zip code, notice I put that in. 44444, or I sure said format like or something like that. All right, so that's it for that one. Hopefully, at least, you have no questions on that. If you do, you're going to have to let me know. What we're going to do is we're going to take a break right now. We're going to come back at, let's make it about 10 after, and then when we do, we're going to quickly go over the next chapter, which is chapter 14, on how to add audio and video. When we get done with that, then we're going to go back and we're going to look at this and how to change that into this. And that's all done with CSS. I'm going to give you all of the CSS. All right, so let's come back, like I said, at about 7:05. Let's make it 5 after. That'll give you 12 minutes.